or sometimes on data methods, or this month it's something even a little different from that. I classify it as a sociological topic, but it was something that drew a lot of interest, and I know we're expecting a full room today. There might be people who scoot in a few minutes late. So what we'll do is I'm going to introduce this topic. We're also going to go around the room and you can all introduce who you are and what organization you work for. And then we will jump right into Gabra's presentation. Well, our presentation today is going to be the social construction of race and what implications that has for professional evaluators, data analysts, and researchers. Or if I'm wrong about that, you can. Our presenters today are Gera Ostgaard from the State Department of Education. She's a results management specialist there. Then we're going to have Nick Peterson, who is an analytics director at Department of Human Services, and Vidya Shankar, who is a PhD candidate at University of Minnesota, also looking at evaluation issues. So we'll first go around the room and people can introduce themselves. I'm Todd Graham. I work as a principal forecaster at Metropolitan Council Research. We'll start in the front.
Hi, I'm Becky Saito, Senior Research Associate at Rainbow Research. I'm Carrie Ann Nash, and I am a progressive intern with Ramsey County, recent graduate of National City and military development.
My name is Glenn Bergerbach. I am an independent researcher. I'm interested in aging and townhomes and condominium associations.
My name is Maisie from Hennepin County Public Health Assessment Team. We do shake surveys.
And I'm Urban Landerman, also from the Hennepin County Public Health.
I'm Angie Pokrell, and I'm with the Minnesota Hospital Association. I'm a quality and process improvement specialist, and Disparity is one of my topic areas.
I'm Nancy with the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry, research and statistics. We do survey of occupational injury and illness in the census and the occupation.
Brian Dakeman, Senior Research Analyst at the Department of Labor and Industry.
I'm Nancy Nystuen, a research analyst at the Minnesota Judicial Branch.
Sarah Heimel, statistician with the U.S. Census Bureau.
Ashley Shaw, researcher at the Youth Council. Kathy Johnson, doing research at the Minnesota Pollution Control.
Sarah Hickey, research scientist at the Minnesota Department of Health.
Tony Godwin, senior planner with Washington County Public Health and Environment.
Sarah Armenia, provides data analytics at
I'm Tim Zilman. I'm a GIS and geospatial data analyst with Hennepin Research.
I'm Jane Vanderplan, a management analyst with Dakota County's Office of Performance Measurement.
Gary Mortensen with the Department of Human Services, Agency and County Performance Case.
Pat Dalton, research analyst and coordinator with nonpartisan research department for the House of Representatives.
Andrea Retke with Allies, an education advocacy organization.
I'm Sarah Stoshak, a research analyst with the Group.
Good afternoon, my name is Olivia Jefferson, and I'm the director of 211. Vivian Basin with Wildlife Research Institute here in Minnesota.
I'm Alan Meltis. I'm a program evaluator at Ramsey County Social Services.
Hi, I'm Kathy Gilmore. I'm the evaluator at Ramsey County.
Williams, Planet for Ramsey County and Disability.
I'm Kirby Pittman. I'm a research analyst at Minnesota County.
Did we get everyone? We missed Ben Boucher.
I am Ben Boucher with Wild Research. I'm taking over for Peter in the interim, setting up and recording things.
Terrific. So we're going to give Gera, Vidya, and Nick approximately 45 minutes, and then or less if you want, and then the balance will be for questions, answers, and discussion. We're going to start with Gera.
All right.
Which of these is it? That's her. Okay.
There you go. Okay.
Hope that works.
I hope so too.
Okay, there we go. All right. So I'm Dave Rockstar, I'm a Regional Measurement Specialist at the Minnesota Department of Education, and I'm here today to talk about some new data collection and that MDE will be really coming up in the future. The reason for this is because it is mandated by legislation, and we'll get into what all of this means. Oh.
Want me to advance? Okay.
Ready to go. Did you do that or did I do that?
I did that.
Okay, so maybe this won't work, but we'll see. I'll let you. Okay. So in 2017, Minnesota legislators revisited a law that was actually passed in 2016. The 2016 law stated that the Minnesota Department of Education was supposed to collect more detailed racial ethnic information beyond the federal 7 codes that everybody collects as of 2012. And the threshold for that was supposed to be for any group in Minnesota that had a population of 1,000 or more. So MDE then worked with the state demographer office and came up with what that list would actually look like. And it was much more substantial, I think, than what people were expecting it to be. So it was revisited again in 2017, and legislators came up with different numbers for the different groups that are currently collected. They did this in consultation with different stakeholder groups. So it doesn't seem that it was totally arbitrary. It was based on what groups are people thinking that there are sort of hidden educational gaps. If you would like more information, I can send you this link or That's amazing. Okay, so what does this actually look like? In 2017, MDE worked again with the state demographer's office based on this new legislation and said, okay, these are the groups. So for the Hispanic Latino population, MDE was required, or will be required to collect 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the top 7 groups, topmost 7 populace in the entire state. That doesn't necessarily mean topmost populace student group. So that's an important distinction to make. For the American Indian group, it is the top 3. For the Asian group, I believe again it's the top 7. For Black, according to federal race code, it's the top 8. And white is white, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. You'll notice that within the more detailed groups, all of the groups have the option for other. And so what that means for the information that we will actually get, we can talk about more, I think, in the question or answer session. People want me to leave this up a little bit longer? Okay.
You said that these were most populated ethnic groups in Minnesota, not students, so it's adult.
Yeah, it's adult, it's everyone. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right, that's a great question. So currently these are the 6 groups that are provided for federal race codes. If you choose more than one, they have a category called mixed. For reporting for this, and we'll get into what reporting could potentially look like. I believe what we're planning on reporting at the state level, and that would only be for like MPAs, MTAs, and graduation rates would be broken out by each group. But when we report up to the federal level, everything is still going to be aggregated up to these larger buckets.
Are these self-identified or are these respective, or sometimes I've seen data collection where?
So that gets into the topic of collecting the information. So for the 18-19 school year, which is the upcoming school year, MDE was mandated to partner with up to 6 partner districts in the entire state of Minnesota. they suggested, they meaning legislators, suggested that we identify these school districts based on region and based on whether or not they were a public or charter. So because they want to get a full representation across the state. How schools actually report this information oftentimes is through an SIS vendor, which is a student information system vendor. And so in talking with our IT, our technology people, they said in order to onboard all the districts in the state, this needs to be one of the things that you take into consideration. I think there's about 8 this vendor currently. We did reach out to more than 6 districts to partner with us on this, but we only heard back from 5. So we have 5 partner districts across the state for the 18-19 school year. What we are proposing is that all school districts essentially re-census their students. So we have a form that will be sent home with students. There's a parent letter, there's a letter for the districts about why this is happening and how this is going to be happening, as well as a frequently asked questions document. I believe that all of these documents will be posted on the MDE website and publicly available, as well as translated into different languages. Statewide implementation is set for the 1920 school year. And in order to make sure that we are collecting this information in the most responsible and ethical way possible, we are really encouraging people to attend community feedback sessions. Our first one, if you want to attend, first one is Monday, October 2nd at the Minnesota Department of Education. And we are also going to be offering these community feedback sessions for anyone to attend. We'll answer your questions. We did have actually looked at the DAC forms and get input on them. And so we're going to be also to do that with the partner districts as well before we ask them to go out and select it.
But did you answer the self-identified?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't answer that question.
Self-identified
Right,
person.
and so that's really, yeah, sorry, I went around. So when the form is currently sent home, like with enrollment or if people come in, it's either the parent or the student that self-identifies. If they do not self-identify, districts are required to report this information they're required to report racial ethnic information based on the best available information they have. I don't know what that looks like for individual districts, nor can I provide them guidance on how to do that. Does that answer that question? So what we're encouraging people to do is to send the form home and have people self-identify. Have the parents or the students self-identify. That is the preferred way, yeah.
So will that be part of the instructions?
Yeah.
That if you do not identify,
Yep, that's in the parent.
you will be identified by somebody else?
Yep, it's in the parent letter, it's in the frequently asked questions document. Yep. Yep, it would be, it depends on that the district call who makes that. That's the local education agency.
You can't tell by what.
No, that's the problem,
Oh, okay.
right? Yes, exactly, and that's why we are asking that they send the form home to all students, because you cannot tell based on what somebody looks like.
And the form will be translated?
And the form will be translated, yeah, yep.
And you
Also,
can check more than one box.
and you can check more than one box. That is also in the questions, which then gets back to that other option, right? Because if people don't want to identify within one of these more detailed groups and they check other, really the information that we're going to end up getting is at the federal 7 level anyway. So when we do the pilot years coming up, we might not get any more detailed information than what we currently have. Which then gets to the research evaluation side. So what information is going to be available, how it will be used, and how it will not be used. So it will only be used for state data collection and reporting purposes. It will be reported to the federal government, as I said, by aggregating it back up into the federal 7 code. It is not going to be tied to immigration status. That is not something that we're mandated to do, it's not something that we are going to do. And this information will not impact whether or not students go to school. And I feel how it not be used is just as important as how it will be. How will it be reported? So MDE will collect and report this information for assessment and graduation data. Assessment data are MCAs, MPAs. That's it. For the pilot year, we're only going to have 5 districts. And so then we have to take into consideration how identifiable are, as MDE does with all of its data. We don't want students to be, we don't want people to work backward in any way to identify students. And so for this first year, the plan is still kind of up in the air, but I believe the plan is just to report across all 5 and not for the individual districts themselves. The same will be for statewide implementation. My understanding is that planning will just be a state report and possibly not at the district level. But that is a call that is beyond myself.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
So for the graduation data,
Yep.
for your pilot, which is just 1 year,
Yep.
it's like, these are the people that started as high school seniors, and how
Right.
many of them?
Yes, right, versus the cohort model, which MD typically uses, right, there's a 4-year cohort, a 7-year cohort. And for this year, it would have to be how many students identified within one of these groups, and then how many of them actually graduated, versus did they graduate on time or anything like that? Yeah,
There be plans in place on how this information could be used if there's disparities about how Department of Education could use this to address those issues that could come up from identifying the different ethnic and racial groups?
That's a really great question, and I believe that that's the spirit with which this legislation was written, was to identify those hidden achievement gaps. And so when we're thinking about the reporting, we need to think about how can we report this in a way that would be most useful for community groups or for legislation. I don't know, we can't control how people use that information, but we can give them the information to hopefully provide better or more targeted services.
So there's nothing that the Department of Education can do.
Not currently, no, but we do have programmatic areas that are interested in this, yes. How they might use that, that would be their call.
Will it be publicly available even for the pilot?
Yes. Yep. This information is publicly, yes.
Are we going to release 5 students? Which 5 students?
That's a great question. Supervisors here, I believe we will. I don't see why we wouldn't. Yeah. But then that gets to the reporting out piece, and whether, and aggregating those 5 together, because there are only 5. Yes.
The last question. For community organizations, in order for them to get the best data they can, have you thought about working with community groups so that they are talking with folks?
Yes.
Students and families.
Yes.
Yep.
And that gets back to these community feedback sessions. Our legislative liaison, her name is Caitlin Schneider, is amazing and has numerous contacts across the Twin Cities and state for different community groups. And so when we sent out the invitation to those community groups as well as to school districts and the partner districts, we very much encourage them to share this information widely and to encourage people to attend these feedback sessions. And so that's how we've been doing that.
I kind of have a twofold question.
Yeah.
So there are like organizations that do annual reports as well. Will you be working with any of those groups to get some of the information that might be duplicated information that's already being gathered on other levels? That was one question. And then the second part of my question was, with the 5 districts that you're going to be working with, how would they reflect demographically the wider spread of groups.
Yeah, so thinking about the, in identifying them, so in 2016, when this law first came about, and they said you need to collect racial ethnic information on any group of 1,000 or more, MDE actually wrote a federal plan to help us do this, to help us implement this work. And so we already had 3 partner districts, and then in 2017, they set up just 6, so we reached out to more, and now we have 5. I can tell you, one of the districts are St. Paul Public Schools, it's Community of Peace, it's Worthington, in the southern corner, it's a smaller charter school up in Bemidji, and then it's also Minnetonka as the, suburban school. And so we did look at the demographic representation of the schools as well to see how closely they align with the state. Or to see the concentration of the different populations as well. And then also thinking about size too, right? Because some of the more rural schools don't have as a diverse population, but we are still asking them to collect that information. And so we need to think about that perspective and that reaction as well.
So I also heard that the last question about connection to the community as not just going into this process, but what follows this process.
Yeah.
Which is what you do. This is highly quantitative, and there is a qualitative piece of this that doesn't feel like it's anybody's responsibility, which is something of it's really just the why question, not just the what. So I'm thinking what you're trying to get at is, so what happens if you just plop this information, and how do you decide what to do with it and what it actually means? It's equally important to collecting it.
Right.
So is there a plan for what happens or how that happens, or?
So the plan would be in how we report the information, but again, we can't control how people use the information. And once the information is made publicly available, people, you can go onto our website and use that information or interpret it in a way that you want. And unless you contact the data analytics inbox and we answer your question about this is the information we have, this is how we suggest you use it, I don't know how we can control that, to some extent. But what I can say is that, I know, but it
to make everybody a little comfortable.
To make everybody
Because there's an enormous qualitative piece that it has to be stood up right next to this, if in fact, it's good intentions, but it doesn't tell you the why. Right? It just tells you the what.
It doesn't tell you the why for why the information is being collected.
Why are there differences? It doesn't help. Well, I think everybody knows there's disparity, so the why question and then who gets engaged about what are you going to do about it is certainly more important than just the what question. Yeah. So that's what I think that's the question you were driving at. I'm sorry, I don't mean that.
I think that's really helpful. I think from a community perspective, we, I'm speaking for myself in particular, we have a lot of data, right? We have externally data on disparities, we know these things, and starting to get to how do we move it to start making policy changes, practice changes, environmental changes, and that's not necessarily, everybody's got their own role in this, right? So I'm not saying this is like, oh yeah, this is what you do. It's not that. Yeah. I think there's just some more partnership that could potentially be happening to get at that why. Like, how do we bring this quantitative with the qualitative in a very responsible way with community alongside it so that we can actually move the why into this quantitative.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd be very happy to sit down and have a conversation with anyone here who has suggestions on how to better do that. And I feel that anyone at MDE would also be happy to sit down and have those conversations, for sure. Absolutely.
And that was why I asked earlier about the annual report. I know it's the Urban League, the one that goes into the national format. So I just wondered, since they locally collect that data specifically to at least the Black population and on par disparities are already, they've been doing that for over 30 years.
Yeah. So why don't we do this? why don't I get the contact information of people who are super interested in this and the why piece and how it can be used, and we can get something on the calendar to help us, help MD and myself move this forward. Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I'm done. That's it. Yep.
Yeah. Want to start talking, and I'll try to find your presentation?
Sure.
Okay.
So my name is Nick Peterson. I work in the agency planning and performance unit at the Department of Human Services. And essentially, what we do is we work across the entire agency to help provide planning, research, and evaluation expertise from the specific program level all the way up to an agency perspective. So one of the perspectives that we always try to bring is we work across the entire agency. So we're trying to do outcome measurement much more broadly from more of a human services system. And we work a lot with the human services performance management team in doing that, which also resides in our department. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit different, and it's going to talk about a little bit more what we're trying to do from an outcome measurement perspective, an evaluation perspective, and some of the challenges that we're working with when we're trying to look at our outcomes and break those down by various racial, ethnic, and communities across the state. And what are some of the ideas that we're using to overcome some of those challenges. Just hit the, I think. So a little bit about DHS, because I think sometimes people don't realize how big we are. So the Department of Human Services is the largest of the state agencies, and we cover everything from Medicaid and Medicare to MNsure, all the way down to child safety and permanency, foster care and adoption programs, the state hospitals, mental health and alcohol and drug abuse programs, the cash and food assistance programs. The scope is pretty wide. And essentially, 1 in 5 Minnesotans touch DHS at any given time. Ultimately, as we have an aging population, everybody interacts with our services in some way. But we interact with about 20% of the state's population. And the way that we interact with the state population is we are a state-supervised, county-administered program, which from an evaluation perspective is really tricky because we pass policy and allocate money up at the state level, but most of our work in direct services is actually conducted by county staff, tribes, and various partner organizations like hospital systems and other managed care organizations. So understanding outcomes can be along the whole path of human services is challenging. So what we're trying to do at DHS is to take kind of a step back and do evaluation from a more person-centered approach. Rather than focus traditionally, we've been very program-oriented. So looking how one specific program is interacting with an individual and how another program is interacting with an individual, but not necessarily putting it together that that individual may be the same person. So thinking rather than program-based evaluation, more of a population outcome-based evaluation. And we've categorized our outcomes into primary categories around health, economic security, child development, stability, safety, and choice. And we kind of view these as wrapping around a person as many ways that we interact with the population we serve. So this is really where we're trying to move toward. And then how our various programs roll up to that population outcome, and how we're looking at it from a measurement perspective is, we have our various divisions, and we've started the process of creating indicators within specific policy areas or program outcomes and the way that they interact with a person. So this is one of the examples. We know from the research that we've done that out-of-home care is highly correlated with experiencing homelessness further down the road. So when we look at the population outcome of stability, that adults and children have stability in their living situation, some examples of the program area indicators that we view that are rolling up into that is we're looking at homelessness. To what extent are people experiencing homelessness? And I should say, we're looking at our population that we serve. We're not normalizing this to the entire state. We're really focusing on our population. And then we're also looking at out-of-home care. So an example would be short-term child protection removal. And these are two indicators that roll up into this overarching outcome of stability. And there are many more. I just stuck two on a slide for simplicity's sake. And this is kind of the framework that we're building, so that we can see how specific programs roll up into those individual long-term outcomes as a population. And then where we're trying to take this even further is to look at these population outcomes and then break it down by various racial, ethnic, ethnicity, and community groups. And then compile all of this information into kind of a one-stop shop to help drive some of our long-term strategy and policy decisions. So the idea is taking, in the past, if you go to our website, you can find a lot of reports, dashboards, and information, even broken down by race and ethnicity, spread all across our website, but we're trying to bring it all together underneath this single framework and put it in a single place. So it's much less siloed, and we can start thinking again wrapped around a single person rather than a specific program. And this is just, we have a working draft of kind of some of the initial indicators. And this is a screenshot from that, where we're starting to see specific indicators broken down by race in a single view.
Okay, this is not live yet.
This is currently in draft form at DHS, so it's in testing phase. So this has been a really, so we've been working, actually really trying to work on this pretty heavily for the last year. And there's a subgroup that's been dedicated to this. And this is a fairly new approach for DHS, is to move outside of the program, think more population, more agency-wide. And especially as we're diving into certain data characteristics, such as race, ethnicity, and community, we've encountered some really interesting challenges and have been documenting these challenges. So where the previous presentation talked about, what they're building a data collection system that they can use for their needs, what we're trying to do is actually leverage our existing legacy data collection system to help feed this information. And some of the challenges in working with legacy systems and trying to to map the data across those systems to feed information, especially around race and ethnicity. The first one, and I'll show an example of this, that we encountered is all of our different systems. A lot of these systems were developed 20, 30 years ago, and they were developed independent of each other. And as a result, we have very disparate definitions of race and ethnicity in those systems. And so how race and ethnicity is recorded in those systems is very different and can make it really challenging to bring data across the different systems. And again, because the systems are developed sometimes under federal direction, so the result is also the programs are using disparate definitions because they're developed in isolation of each other. So that was kind of the first challenge that we encountered. And as we're identifying these disparate definitions, and we're trying to bring a little bit more conformity to them. The process to add new identification criteria to these systems is very lengthy because a lot of these systems are tied to federal programs. So an example would be the addition of community characteristics to Maxis. Maxis is our food and cash benefit assistance and eligibility program or system. So this is the system that helps a family determine if they're eligible for receiving SNAP and food assistance programs or general assistance and GRH, some of the housing subsidy programs. So these programs are defined and built around a lot of that federal direction. And to change them, especially because they're rolled out across the entire state, and they're actually data is entered at the county level as well as nonprofit contractors, making changes is really challenging. So it takes a long time, which is problematic, especially as we see potentially different refugee populations or new immigrant populations coming to the state. So we want to be adaptable and make sure that we're tracking this information, but the process isn't necessarily as responsive as we would like. And then the third big challenge that we have is these systems don't have unified data governance frameworks. And what that means is some of the systems raise changes over time. And we know from personal interactions as well as research that identification of race, ethnicity, and community can change as an individual evolves. So our systems allow for that. So they may have identified a certain way 10 years ago when they first enter the system, but next time that they're asked when they go to the county office to work on their application, they may change how they identify, and it overwrites the previous field. So we actually, and some systems do that, but not all the systems do that. So again, this is like where some of the challenges come in place. And then also, some of the criteria is based off of data integration, which I'll show you one where you can tell it's the result of many systems combining to be a single. As a result, how individuals identify as a particular racial group or ethnicity or community, becomes a little bit of a data nightmare because it's the result of multiple systems coming together. So this is kind of like what we're trying to overcome are these challenges in coming together with a unified approach to measuring outcomes across the agency in a consistent manner.
Is there any plan for all state agencies to, in 10 years even, I mean, or something, have some sort of unified ethnicity and immigration variables that are consistent across the state?
At this time, I am not aware of any plan to consistently track race, ethnicity, or community across the state. So this is a snapshot of what I'm kind of talking about. And what's not captured in this is the extent to which these fields are populated vary depending on the system. So this is looking at 6 of our core systems. So SSIS, which is our Adult and Child Protection System, Axis, which is our Food Cash Assistance Program, MMIS is the claims database for all public medical assistance programs, NEC Squared, which is our child care assistance system, child support system, which is PRISM, and the licensing system. What's not included is Avatar, which is our electronic records management system that we use in our direct care and treatment facilities, as well as METS, which is the system that was put in place under the ACA to help with the rollout of MNsure. That in particular is problematic because here we essentially can roll up to these criteria. METS has, they just told me what the categorization was last night, which is why it's not here. And that has 17 different codes that people can enter. And it's a very different interaction that people have. So we're trying to kind of map these all together and roll them up, which is why we went through this process of documenting and working across all of the systems. Yes?
I just have a question. I don't want to throw your presentation off anything. But something that's throwing me off a little bit is in one particular group, do they lose nationality when they're now second generation born here? I mean, first generation born here? So if I was from Nigeria originally, I mean, I'm just noticing that you've got African American, but you have Black, and Black is a nationalist or a nationalism perspective versus African American, depending on how people identify. But if you're foreign born here, something happens up here that seems like it's lost in the translation.
Yeah, again, a lot of these systems are program eligibility systems. So the extent that someone would identify of a specific nationality is probably based off of their how it would impact their eligibility for that particular program. So that's the interaction that they're going to have with the front end worker, is they would identify their nationality as part of the eligibility determination.
So with that being said, that person could actually identify as multi-race and throw that scheme off on that.
They could potentially. So the first 4 systems, if they identify multiple race, it's check all that apply. So we actually, in the data, we know how they've identified as multiple race because they've selected 2 or more races. The last 2 systems, multiple races, is actually a selection, and it's a select 1. So if they select multiple race, we don't know.
So there's an actual distinction then from race versus where you're born.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
I get it. Okay. Wow. Okay.
And then, yeah, we have foreign born, but again, the extent to which that's populated varies across the system. So this has been like one of the really big, this was the first time when we put this together 6 months ago, it was the first time that we actually did this kind of mapping. And this is kind of leading us on our discussion of how to really think about this a little bit more consistently. What this kind of means in terms of like reporting is essentially when we're thinking about our agency-wide outcomes, the degree to which we can report levels of specificity or disaggregation depends on what we're including and the level of reporting. So at the highest level, because all these systems are different, we are kind of limited to 6 categories. So African American and or Black, American Indian, Asian or Pacific Islander, Hispanic ethnicity, 2 or more races, or white. That's kind of the common, like what we can roll all the systems up to. When we look at specific systems, we're able to start breaking it down further and further, all the way down to when we start looking at outcomes for specific programs, depending on the program, we can disaggregate all the way down to specific communities. So we know we can, for some of the systems, we can specifically, we can look in the data and work and analyze it based off of individuals that their country of origin with Somalia, they speak Somali or potentially a different language, because we will have country of origin, but also language spoken at home. And then we also can get at family composition as well, depending on the system and the specific program, because they ask those questions and we can establish parent-child relationships. So for kind of our agency-wide outcomes, we're really limited to kind of those 6 buckets. But as we get further and further down into the levels of detail for specific programs, it does allow us to look at outcomes and particular disparities across different communities at a much greater level of detail, which is ultimately what we're trying to do so that we can be more targeted in our services. So how are we trying to kind of overcome these challenges? So the first is, we really want to establish a better understanding of how our communities should be identified in our systems. And so we are working to engage community stakeholders. We do have a body that is established as a direct connection with the communities that we serve. And we're working with them to help make recommendations for different categorization of race, ethnicity, and communities in our system. So working with the communities to help identify what our future state of data should be. Our second kind of way that we're overcoming this is we are trying to cross-populate. So in systems where we have that level of detail, can we cross-populate that data over to the other systems where we don't? A unique opportunity in the analysis that we're doing is we're creating a much stronger understanding of how people change their identification of race over time. And so some of the systems override it. There are system fields in the background that track how race is overwritten. And so we're trying to look at those so that we can understand how the identification of different groups is changing and bringing that into our analysis. And the fourth is we are in the process of what's called systems modernization. And part of that is to create a much stronger data governance framework. And so we're using that as an opportunity to really make our data governance framework and really help improve the quality of data so that we can better measure these outcomes and feed more information to our policymakers and our decision makers and the communities that we're working with high quality data. So that's what we're trying to do. Yes.
I am struggling a bit with the fact that race and ethnicity often seems to be the only distinction made among people or students or whomever you are looking at. Partly, I would say, because it's easier to collect than lots of other information. But by being the one and only thing often that distinguishes a certain outcome, homelessness, it just strikes me as, because your grandparents came from Japan, is not leading to your homelessness any more than my grandparents coming from Norway. It might be, I had parents who were on drugs, or I was abused as a child, or a bajillion other things. So I guess I'm just, maybe it's an opinion rather than a question, but because what you measure gets discussed, it feels like we're putting an inordinate amount of meaning on these things that I don't find meaningful, really.
Well, save that for my session.
All right.
15 to 20 minutes, which I was told that I would get. So, okay, so what do we mean when we say that race is a social construct? I'm curious, because we say it all the time. Okay, so if this is common knowledge, let me know, but I think many of us are researchers here, and a construct is a theoretical creation, right? It's something you cannot directly observe or indirectly observe. So we construct constructs. We do that as researchers. We build them. And then if we say that race is a social construction, shun is a Latin suffix
that makes a noun from a verb. So construction is the nominal form of the verb to construct. And being the noun form of a verb, it requires an actor. We are those actors. So every time that we measure, every time we collect, measure, analyze, interpret, and report, we are constructing race in our daily work, all right? And we always have, okay? So the test of statistical significance was developed deliberately by the eugenics movement to prove the differences among skull sizes. It was premised on the idea that genius lies in distinction, and so if you can distinguish more, if you can distinguish yourself more, that's why publications also are based on if you can find significance, right? Significant results. There's no test of similarity. There's only a variety of tests of difference. And again, every time we choose to disaggregate or not, we participate in this construction, right? So, so this is anticipating actually a lot of the questions that you all raised earlier. Okay, so we have not only constructed race quantitatively, but we construct race qualitatively. All, I would argue, of our programming that we measure, research, evaluate, is rooted in the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson, which were premised on the war on poverty, which defined the Negro family as pathological. Okay, so that was the construction of the Negro race, right? And these were the subsections of the Tangle of Pathology chapter. And you can see that it's really not very different today. This is what we evaluate for the most part. You know, single parent homes are pathologized. Youth of color, more broadly now, are pathologized, and delinquency and crime are associated, are the definition of blackness, right? So, so if race is a social construct or construction, why do we continue to pay attention to it, right? Why don't we collect data about eye color? I would argue it's about disproportionalities and disparities. Are we trying to detect them? Are we trying to measure them? Are we trying to understand them? Are we trying to eliminate them? Is this a gaping wound that we just keep on measuring more and more accurately, right? With different tools, and then, you know, we talk about it. But we don't collect data and measure and evaluate data about eye color because that's not how we have organized society, okay? Not in this century and in this continent. When eye color was important, we did pay attention to eye color, right? In Nazi Germany, there was a lot of attention paid to eye color. So the entire premise of my dissertation, which is already 200-something pages, by the way, is that disparities and disproportionalities are not a result of racialized difference, okay? Racialized difference was produced through disparities and disproportionalities. And I'm not saying that talking about them makes them a problem. I'm not saying that's a whole other narrative. I'm not saying that talking about race is what causes racism. Please do not go away thinking that I'm saying that. I'm saying that disparities and disproportionalities are encoded in the definition of race. This is how we normally understand race, that it's attached to us as a human being, right? And it's just, it's diverse. Like we all come from somewhere, right? We are starting to move, I hope, toward a more critical understanding of race as something that is produced and reproduced. And we keep on producing it in our work, regardless of our work, but especially as researchers and evaluators and analysts. And it takes place over time, that production and that reproduction, through relationships. It is inherently a relational category. Difference is relational, right? Diverse, theoretically, is relational. It's become code. Diverse has become code for Brown, right? Culture is also another code word. Cultural groups, as if all groups are not cultural, right? And the relationships are asymmetrical and structurally mediated. They are, in fact, dialectical, actually. So race was dialectically produced, which I'll explain in a second. So one example of the disproportionality. So I'm not talking here about disproportionalities within categories, which I spent a lot of time measuring at Ramsey County, actually. But I'm talking about just generally, right? We tend to think, well, this is a majority white society. Okay, we forget that it was artificially produced. Okay, this is not naturally a white society. And our institutions are not naturally white because of lack of opportunity. We created white institutions, okay? You don't get to 92% CEOs who are white, 92% foundation executives who are white, and 92% boards that are white by accident in a country that's not 92% white. And that wouldn't have been anywhere near 92% white were it not for these, right? Okay, so these are all ongoing. Segregation, as many of you know, right, and disparities are worse now than before the civil rights movement. So disparity also defines race. The disparities now in wealth, for example, and I'm only choosing one example. We could do this for all of the different racial groups, right? This is one example, black-white disparities. If you amortize, I guess would be the word, the black-white wealth gap upon emancipation to today, it would be exactly what you see. Okay, and that doesn't count, it doesn't even count segregated education and housing and all the other hurdles that were put in former enslaved labor, right, in their way. So the disparities that we see are not surprising. Like we tend to think that, well, why aren't they catching up? What's wrong? What's going on? We keep measuring it, measuring it. But it's encoded in the definition, right, of racial groups. So instead of narrowing with time, the disparity is widening because they're exponentially increasing. So, like I said, status of property versus property owner, that's where disparity is encoded, right in the definition. Blackness is property. Whiteness is potential property owner, okay? That's a disparity right there. And the category was produced to maintain that system, right? So it became really important to distinguish between black and white because you wouldn't want to be confused, right, with property. So these disparities continue to expand, compound exponentially, reproducing this racialized difference. Okay, and we continue to do that in the systems that we work in. So in every case where we're in a relationship of where we're exploiting the labor, right, or marginalizing, or putting people in a position of powerlessness, we're reproducing that owner-property dynamic, right? So the difference is racialized inherently, by definition. So dialecticism is one way that we have defined race. If we put whiteness at the center, and whiteness means civilization, we had to create the savage in order to civilize, right? Whiteness is ownership, and we created blackness, which needs to be owned, needs to be managed. And whiteness is belonging on this land. Asianness is the perpetually foreign threat. So how do we know this? We know this because the rules for race are not consistent, right? So one drop of black blood, it was enough to be black because you wanted more wealth in the form of slaves, right? You wanted more labor. But one drop of indigenous blood wasn't enough because you would need to cede more land. All right, the more indigenous people you had, you would need to cede more land. And many Asians are actually Caucasian. South Asians are Caucasian, okay? If you trace our DNA and our language, we come from the Caucasus, but we were not white, right? So in our case, our names, our skin color, our eye shape, our religion was all enough to ensure that we may be Caucasian, but we're not white. We also see it in the way people are counted, right? So this is an ongoing question. And if you look at census records, you can see how the definitions change and how groups contested, like Indian South Asians contested whether they could emigrate and naturalize based on their Caucasianness. And then you can see the debates about how, well, yeah, but they're Hindu, and so, you know, they can't, right? So 3/5 of Black populations were counted? Was it because they were worth more than indigenous people? No, it's so that slave-holding states would have more power, right, in national decision-making. And so indigenous folks were counted at 0 because they need to disappear, right, in the narrative of settler colonization. And Asians were excluded entirely because we could not emigrate, except during periods where our labor was needed. So we weren't even counted. So this is the logic, right? Land, labor, national identity. And we see this in the way this plays out today, right? So in terms of Japanese internment, right? So the Japanese during World War II might have been here for centuries, not centuries yet, they would have been a generation, right? And they were still not American enough, right? Muslims today, with Islamophobia, you could be here for generations as a Muslim, but you're still not American enough. I could be born and raised here, but based on my name, have my bank account application rejected based on I'm not American, right? So Patrick O'Connor could have come yesterday from Ireland and will not be questioned, right? This is an example of what not to do, okay? All right, so, for example, we start, I don't know what order they're listed in. They're not alphabetical and they're not by any other logic, except that white's on top, right? Only white is distinguished between Hispanic and non-Hispanic, all right? As if that distinction isn't salient. Hispanic, as people have already said, can be of any race, right? It just means colonized by Spain or Portugal, which, by the way, all these groups have been, including Asians, all right? The distinction between U.S.-born Black and foreign-born Black suggests that U.S. foreign-born distinction is only important to Blacks, right? As if there are not Asians who have been here for generations and foreign-born Asians, right? And as if that distinction isn't salient, right? Instead, the distinction among Asians is between other Asians and Southeast Asians, okay? As if the difference is geographic, okay? But it's not a geographic difference. The reason we see difference between those two groups is not because one group is other Asian and one group is Southeast Asian. It's because there was a war in Southeast Asia that the U.S. was heavily involved in, all right? And the only other Asians that were allowed were immigrants, okay, who were selectively recruited because of their advanced degrees in math and science through the post-1965 Immigration Act, okay? So before that, you couldn't come if you were Asian, except to work on the railroad, right? They changed immigration laws and said you can come if you have an advanced degree in math and science. If you just look at this graph, you might say, oh, well, what's the big deal? The Asians have come here and they're doing just fine, right? Not calculating that the education level is higher than white, family size is larger, number of earners is bigger, right? And so this graph doesn't account for family size, number of earners, education level, and it disaggregates in a way that maintains this notion of who's doing well and who isn't doing well and why, right? So if we want to continue reifying, reinscribing, reproducing race, we can continue to analyze, disaggregate with no understanding of history, right? And that includes migration and labor history, among other histories. We can inconsistently and erroneously use proxies like geographic origin instead of distinctions like immigrant versus refugee. We can, this is what a lot of you are getting at, repeatedly, like almost fetishize the disparities and the disproportionalities without ever questioning, right, the overperformance, right, which is represented in the last group. So whites are always the standard of comparison, right? Even if another group is outperforming whites, okay, that's presented as a threat, right? It's still whites that maintain the standard. And if, like I said, if Asians are outperforming, then we become the threat, right? And without thinking, again, about why we might be outperforming, right? There's a very specific reason why. Okay, so if we want to shift this dynamic, we need to collect other data. Okay, we cannot keep on collecting race in a vacuum, like you were saying, and just throw in the disparities and the disproportionalities out there for people to do with whatever they want. Because it's really easy to weave them into a narrative that maintains the status quo. And so we could get data, for example, on fallback position. Okay, so like the Indians that came from my generation, we all came with a fallback position that included families and property in India. Okay, so you cannot argue that, well, you're just as dark as this person over here who survived centuries of slavery and segregation and say, well, obviously there's no racism in this country, right? Country of birth, parents' birth, situational risk versus intergenerational poverty, immigrant versus refugee status. Those kinds of distinctions are important. That's why I was like, just wait. I think. Okay, this is just an example again. So we think about language, you know, but are we really thinking, I was thinking about the forms that are going to go home with kids' parents, right? Like, are they in a language that is typically written? You know, are they, what is the literacy level, right, of whatever the race, right? So these are things that would actually cut across race. You could actually form interventions based on this. On race data alone, you cannot act on race data alone. All you can do is reinforce your idea of the deficient races and the superior races. But you cannot develop an institutional intervention or a structural intervention based on race data in the absence of data about structural forces. I think that's it. Yeah. Sorry, I sped through, I know, but I wanted to get you all kind of on time. So I can provide all the citations that I would like.
Are all these PowerPoints to be made available?
Yes, thank you. We will